Okay, this is part two of the Gerald Ford lecture. So you watched part one, you watched the short pardon video where Ford explains his early September 1974 pardon of former President Nixon. As Ford said, now officially the long national nightmare is over. Unfortunately for America, just because the whole Watergate saga ends does not mean that good times immediately return. In fact, as bad as some of the things may seem in the first half of the 70s, the second half of the 70s is rougher. Because one thing that was a constant in this country, really since the days of World War II through the early 70s, was a strong economy. Unfortunately, we begin to see that change. In 1973, we saw a major blow to the United States from OPEC. OPEC are oil producing countries of the Middle East. Countries like Saudi Arabia, for example, and many others. They're countries that are primarily Islamic, and they're countries that, at a time where tensions between the Islamic world, Arabs, and Israel, Jews, was on a very high trajectory. Conflict was present. There were several Arab-Israeli wars in the 1970s. Going back to the formation of Israel, which we've talked about briefly in class, the United States has always been deeply supportive of the Israelis. Well, in large part in retaliation for that, in 1973, OPEC nations cut the supply of oil to the United States by nearly 50%. Meaning fuel that we receive from Middle Eastern countries is cut nearly in half. The impact of this is devastating. When you think about it, what's that going to mean? The most immediate thing that probably comes to your mind is increased fuel costs, more expensive gas, more expensive fuel to heat your home. Absolutely. And those are both realities. By 1974, we're seeing it. President Nixon, in an effort to try to get people to conserve fuel, works with the Transportation Department, and they institute a maximum speed limit of 55 miles an hour on all American highways. While they don't have the authority at the federal government to mandate that by law, they effectively have the power by mandating any access to federal highway funds contingent upon a state's willingness to lower their limit to 55 and show records of enforcement. So effectively, the federal government forced every state to do this. Gas prices do go up dramatically. Fuel had always been plentiful in the United States in large ways. Going back to the 50s, the heyday of the American automobile, gas was cheap. And it continued that way through the 60s and into the early 70s. But now when you cut the price, or when you cut the supply of oil by 50% into the United States from the part of the world that we rely upon for fuel, the price of gas in many cases is going to double. You're going to see fuel prices that increase upwards of $1.50, $1.75 a gallon, which is demonstrably larger than where it had been. Well, there's another impact to that. Think of how that's going to increase the price of consumer goods. By the 1970s, we have these 18-wheeler giant, trucks driving on highways. And what's inside those trucks? What's inside airplanes? What's inside cargo ships? All which require fuel. There's food. There's clothes. There's furniture. There's appliances. There's electronics. Consumer goods. And what's going to happen is, as the fuel costs of those 18-wheelers rise, as the fuel costs of ships rise, as the fuel costs for airplanes rise, you're going to see the price of consumer goods increase. You're going to see the price of goods increase on everything from milk and eggs and butter and bread that people rely on, to gas, to big ticket items like cars and television sets and refrigerators. Well, what happens is, with the price of goods rising, we begin to see the economy struggling. Unemployment ticks up. We move into a recessionary period. We move into an inflationary period where the price of goods goes up, but the value of the American dollar goes down. These were all happening in the late stages of the Nixon presidency, which, in addition, of course, to Watergate, further lowered his support with the American people in 73 into 74. Well, now this is what President Ford inherits. Now, Ford's a moderate Republican, but he says, why don't we, his ideas are let's do tax cuts. Let's find ways to try to cut back on spending. Well, that's not going to fly with the Congress. The Congress is very strongly Democratic, and then in the midterm elections of November of 74, just months after Nixon resigned, Democrats gain a lot more seats. The sins of Watergate hurt the Republican Party across the board. Bottom line is the Democrats have like a 2/3 plus supermajority in the House and Senate. They're not going to agree with President Ford trying to implement any conservative or even moderate policies. Ford's going to actually have a huge number of vetoes in his 2.5 years as president. But what's going to occur here is that you're not going to get any of Ford's policies enacted. Ford's not going to go for the Democratic plans of increasing taxes. So you have a lot of impasse in place. Ford initiates the Whip Inflation Now program, WIN. He goes on national television in 1975 and talks to the American people about how inflation is a grave concern to us as a country. And to show the government's commitment and Ford's commitment to dealing with this, he initiates Whip Inflation Now. And he's got this button when he speaks to the nation on his jacket that says WIN or WIN. And he explains to the American people, let's go out and all get a button. You could get them, they gave them away, or you get one for a nickel or less at a store. And Ford's idea with that was we could show solidarity, we could show unity, that we're all in this together and we're all working to stop inflation. And Americans liked that. It was part of the style of Gerald Ford, more everyday guy, common man. The problem with Ford, and this will be a continuing problem through his presidency, is things just don't get better. So a year later in 1976, as you go to the store and you spent 10+% more than you would have spent a year ago on groceries. Well, you look on your jacket and you still got this button that subs WIN, but nothing's changed. Inflation's gotten worse. I think I'll take that button off. Ford has a series of setbacks. Another one involves the domino. In the post-Watergate years again, the Democrats controlling the House and Senate. In the Senate, there was a major push led by the last surviving Kennedy brother, Senator Ted Kennedy, to potentially cut back on our aid, the money we offer to the South Vietnamese. Well, North Vietnam's paying attention. Now we know that ceasefire was a ceasefire made to be broken. In 1975, the North Vietnamese break the ceasefire and lead an invasion into South Vietnam. Ford actually talks about potentially sending American troops back to Vietnam. That's not happening, though. In the end, the North Vietnamese in April of 1975 make their way into South Vietnam, making their way all the way to Saigon. They take the country. And the last photos of American non-combat personnel fleeing South Vietnam is a painful, painful image for the American people. Because after all we gave for that war, the 60,000 or so Americans who lost their lives, the countless others who were injured, but also the way that Vietnam War economically, politically, socially tore at the fabric of this nation. And then the ceasefire is broken and the domino falls. Unlike Korea, which still to this day you have a North and a South, South Vietnam lasted only a little over 2 years after the ceasefire. South Vietnam falls, and true to form of the domino theory, Laos and Cambodia are not far behind. This is another punch in the gut to the American people. Nothing seems to be going right. You're going to watch the end after you watch the third of my 3 lecture videos here. You're going to watch the last 5 minutes of the century video approaching the apocalypse that we've been watching the last couple days in class, because I didn't show you yet, but I want you to see the fall of Vietnam. It's sad, but it truly makes it America's lost war. Though we weren't in there, it wasn't on our watch when the domino fell. We still very much take that as our own. The last thing I'll say about President Ford, fine man. I think even his political opponents would say Jerry Ford's a good person. Ford at times ran into, though, the cultural phenomenon of this era, where the respect, the reverence that you would have for an FDR, a Dwight Eisenhower, or most presidents we've had in our nation's history. The times are changing. By the second half of the 70s, we're into the so-called, you might call it the Saturday Night Live generation, where it becomes acceptable to make fun of our leaders. You know, the presidencies of Johnson and Nixon really hurt a lot of the credibility of that office in how they both ended. And Ford feels the effect of that. Ford had this propensity every now and then, though he's a very smart man, to mangle some words, to say things that don't come out right. He had this thing too where a couple times he's walking down the stairs of either Air Force One or the helicopter Marine One, and he tumbles, misses a step, and down goes President Ford. He's okay, but of course it's something people look at and make light of. Well, Chevy Chase would play Jerry Ford in Saturday Night Live, and he'd play this bumbling fool who can't speak right, who is always falling down. And in that, it kind of shows an erosion of the respect for the presidency, which in a post-Vietnam and post-Watergate America, we said exists. And the reality of those things are that Ford has to sometimes overcome the Ford isn't bright type stuff, which, wasn't real, but it was perceived that way. Long story short, as we head into 1976, Ford decides, though he never planned on being president, he'd like to win his own term. So he declares his candidacy, where he's going to run to be the Republican nominee and hope to win his own term as president in the fall of 76. Well, I have one last lecture video for the day today. So you're going to stop this one, and you're going to jump right to lecture video number 3, the one about the 1976 election.